The 6 folders were not supposed to be on the same desk. They had been prepared by different offices, under different seals, by people who had never been told they were working on the same story. One came from the Vatican Bank. One came from the Secretariat of State. One came from the doctrine of the faith. One came from communications. One came with no department name at all, only a handwritten note in the margin. The last came from evangelization, thick with maps, budgets, mission reports, and numbers so carefully arranged that they looked more like a corporate presentation than the life of the church. At 5:38 in the morning, the folders were carried into a small room near the private library of the Apostolic Palace. No cameras were present, no press release had been drafted, no senior cardinal had been invited to soften the language or slow the decision down. Pope Leo XIV entered alone. He did not look tired. That was what disturbed the 2 aides waiting outside the door. Men who have worked long enough inside Rome know the difference between anger and decision. Anger moves quickly, decision moves quietly. Leo moved quietly. He placed his breviary on the table, opened the first folder, and began reading the same names he had already read in silence for weeks. Roco Bellerini, Alestister Finch, Gard Steiner, Javier Mendoza, Lorenzo Dantis, Tiago Souza. 6 names, 6 offices, 6 invisible columns holding up the old Vatican. By sunrise, every one of them would be standing on ground that had already shifted beneath their feet. What happened that morning was not announced as a purge. That word never appeared in the official Vatican statement. It was not called punishment. It was not called revenge. It was not called a revolution. The language of Rome remained polished, restrained, almost gentle. The Holy Father thanks him for his years of service. The Holy Father has accepted his resignation. The Holy Father has appointed an interim commission. The Holy Father has ordered an audit. The Holy Father asks for prayers. But everyone inside those walls understood what the statements were hiding. A pope who had spent his life among the poor had opened the machinery of power and found that too much of it no longer served the gospel. Too much money protected itself. Too much diplomacy had become afraid of truth. Too much doctrine had been used without tenderness. Too much communication had been polished until it no longer looked human. Too many appointments had passed through invisible hands. Too much mission had become management. And on that morning, Leo XIV decided that the church could not heal what it refused to expose. Before we go further, stay with this story, because this is not only about 6 cardinals losing influence. It is about the question every Catholic institution eventually has to face. Can the church still preach conversion if its own structures refuse to convert? To understand why that morning mattered, you have to go back to the first folder. It was blue, bound with a metal clip, and marked with the initials IOR, the Institute for the Works of Religion, the Vatican Bank. Inside that folder was the world Cardinal Roco Bellerini had spent more than 20 years protecting. Bellerini was not famous in the way public cardinals are famous. He did not enjoy crowds. He did not give emotional homilies. He rarely appeared on television. His strength was not in his voice. It was in access. He knew where the accounts were held, which foundations belonged to which religious orders, which contracts had been signed in the name of charity, which donors expected silence, and which financial structures were too complicated for ordinary bishops to understand. In Rome, they called him the Wall, not because he blocked doors with force, but because he made questions die before they reached the room where answers lived. A bishop from Latin America once asked for a transparent report on funds raised in his country for schools that had never been built. 3 months later, he received a letter so technical, so layered in accounting language, that even his diocesan finance officer could not explain what it meant. Another bishop requested details on a property sale linked to a missionary foundation. The request disappeared into channels. A third tried to ask directly. He was told that certain matters required discretion for the good of the church. Bellerini understood the power of that phrase. For the good of the church. It could mean charity. It could mean protection. It could mean prudence. It could also mean yikaruwainans. Under his leadership, silence became a system. His supporters insisted he had kept the Vatican financially alive during difficult decades. They said he knew how to deal with bankers, diplomats, donors, and religious superiors who spoke the language of piety in public and the language of assets in private. They said no one understood the financial web better than he did. They were right. That was exactly why Leo XIV considered him dangerous. The Pope had not come to Rome from financial comfort. Before his election, Robert Francis Prevost had spent years in Peru, in parishes where a missing donation meant medicine not purchased, roofs not repaired, children walking another year to schools that existed only in promises. He had seen what happened when money meant for the poor traveled through too many hands. He had seen how people at the edges of the church learned not to ask where the funds went, because asking only deepened the wound. One afternoon, months before the dismissal, Leo received a report about a rural clinic in the Andes that had closed twice in 1 year, because the promised support from a Vatican-linked foundation had arrived late and incomplete. The report was only 4 pages. It contained no dramatic accusation. It simply listed dates, transfers, delays, and consequences. At the bottom, a local sister had written in Spanish, "The children do not understand that Rome is reviewing the matter. They only know the medicine is gone." Leo circled that sentence. Then he asked for the files. That was when Bellerini's world began to tremble. For 6 weeks, a small team of lay auditors worked under direct papal authority. They did not announce themselves loudly. They did not accuse. They requested documents, account statements, contracts, property transfers, foundation agreements, advisory fees, donor restrictions, internal communications. At first, the responses were slow, then incomplete, then defensive. Finally, the Pope sent one instruction in writing: "All financial documents requested under my authority are to be delivered in full. Delay will be treated as refusal." After that, the folders arrived. The first folder did not accuse Bellerini of stealing. That would have been simpler. It accused him of something more Vatican and more difficult: constructing a financial environment in which no one outside his circle could know enough to hold anyone accountable. It showed funds moved between charitable entities without clear explanations. It showed consultancy fees paid to firms with personal connections to senior clergy. It showed projects announced publicly as acts of mercy and then buried in delays, revisions, and partial funding. When Leo finished the folder, he reportedly said only one sentence: "The poor cannot be asked to finance our shadows." That sentence became the beginning of the decree. Cardinal Bellerini received the letter at 7:12 in the morning. He was in his office preparing for a routine meeting. The letter was short. His office was ended effective immediately. His authority over accounts, transfers, appointments, internal reviews, and external financial relationships was suspended. The Vatican Bank would be placed under temporary audit supervision. All direct staff were ordered to preserve records and avoid deleting or moving any files. By 8:00, his office doors were sealed. By 8:30, his private phone line had been disconnected from internal routing. By 9:15, 3 bankers outside Vatican City knew something had gone wrong. And by noon, the rumor moving through Rome was simple: the wall had fallen. But Bellerini was only the first folder. The second was white, thin, and more dangerous than it looked. It carried the seal of the Secretariat of State and the name of Cardinal Alestister Finch. Finch had built his life in rooms without microphones. He was British, elegant, unfailingly polite, and almost impossible to read. His friends described him as the man who kept the church present in places where open confrontation would have destroyed fragile communities. His critics called him something else: the White Fox. For 15 years, Finch had been the hidden architect of Vatican diplomacy. He could enter a conference in Brussels, say almost nothing publicly, and leave with a commitment no one expected. He knew which minister hated which bishop, which regime could tolerate a Catholic school, but not a Catholic newspaper, which ambassador needed praise, which dictator needed silence, and which suffering community would pay the cost of a badly timed moral statement. His defenders had evidence on their side. In parts of Asia, churches remained open because Finch had negotiated quietly. In Eastern Europe, hostile legislation had been softened because Finch had found language everyone could survive. In Africa, humanitarian access had been preserved through private agreements that never appeared in headlines. He had protected real people. But the second folder asked a harder question: at what point does prudence become complicity? The folder contained diplomatic cables, meeting notes, informal understandings, and unsigned memoranda. It showed a pattern Leo XIV found impossible to ignore. In certain countries, the Vatican had remained silent, not only to protect persecuted Catholics, but to preserve access, status, and influence. In one case, a bishop's public warning about political prisoners had been delayed after Finch's office argued that the timing would damage negotiations. In another, a statement about violence against religious minorities had been reduced to vague language after a government objected. In a third, a Catholic aid network was advised not to speak about abuses committed by a regime that had quietly guaranteed church property rights. Finch called this the burden of diplomacy. Leo called it the temptation of power. The confrontation between them happened 2 weeks before the dismissal. It was not loud. Finch arrived carrying a leather folder of his own, prepared with the confidence of a man who had survived 3 pontificates. By anticipating every objection, he argued that diplomacy requires shadows. He argued that the church cannot help anyone if it loses access. He argued that moral language must sometimes be delayed in order to preserve space for future action. Leo listened. Then he asked Finch whether Christ had ever negotiated the Beatitudes in order to remain welcome at a powerful table. Finch did not answer immediately. Those close to the meeting say the silence lasted long enough to become the answer. The dismissal was delivered by hand, while Finch was in a video conference with foreign representatives. He ended the call, read the letter, closed his laptop, and remained standing for almost a minute. Then he turned to his aide and said, "So he has chosen prophecy over position. I was not entirely wrong." Leo XIV was not rejecting diplomacy. He was rejecting diplomacy that became ashamed of the gospel. The church would still speak to governments, negotiate protections, and defend vulnerable communities. But under Leo, those conversations would no longer be built on the assumption that truth was too dangerous to name. The official statement thanked Finch for his years of service and wished him peace in early retirement. Peace, prayer, no explanation. But every diplomat in Rome understood that the Vatican's language had changed. A church that loses influence may suffer. A church that loses its soul has already suffered too much. The third folder was gray and heavier than the others. It came from the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith. On the front page was the name Cardinal Gard Steiner. If Bellerini had guarded money and Finch had guarded access, Steiner had guarded boundaries. How was Bavarian, austere, brilliant, and feared in the way only highly disciplined men can be feared. His memory was legendary. He could quote councils, canons, papal documents, and obscure theological condemnations from centuries past without opening a book. His office was precise. His clothing was precise. His theology was precise. For many Catholics, Steiner was a necessary anchor in an age of confusion. He spoke with absolute confidence about truth, sin, authority, and the danger of adapting doctrine to cultural fashion. He believed the church was not a parliament, and that revelation could not be revised by majority sentiment. On that point, Leo XIV did not disagree. The problem was not that Steiner believed in truth. The problem was what happened to people who encountered his truth without mercy. The gray folder did not contain financial corruption. It contained letters, dozens of them, some from theologians under investigation, some from bishops whose pastoral initiatives had been frozen by Rome, some from priests who had asked for clarification and received suspicion, some from lay scholars who had spent years serving Catholic institutions and then found themselves silenced by one sentence from the dicastery. Several letters had been sent directly to the Pope after his election. At first, he read them one at a time. Then he began asking for the files behind them. The pattern disturbed him. Under Steiner, the dicastery had treated questioning as danger before determining whether the question came from rebellion or genuine pastoral need. Theologians working in wounded communities were judged by formulations drafted in offices far from those wounds. Pastors dealing with poverty, addiction, migration, violence, family breakdown, and moral chaos were often answered with suspicion when they asked how doctrine could be taught without crushing those already barely standing. Steiner's defenders said the church cannot let experience rewrite revelation. Leo agreed, but he believed revelation had entered human experience in the flesh of Christ. A doctrine that never bends down to wash feet has not understood the Lord who gave it. The meeting between Leo and Steiner lasted 47 minutes. Steiner arrived with confidence. He carried documents demonstrating the dangers of doctrinal ambiguity. He warned that mercy without truth becomes sentimentality. He warned that pastoral language can become a doorway through which confusion enters. He warned that if Rome weakens the walls, the wolves will not ask permission before entering. Leo listened carefully. Then he said, "A wall that keeps out wolves is useful, A wall that keeps out the wounded is a scandal. Steiner's face reportedly tightened. The Pope continued, "Doctrine is a lamp. If it helps people see the path, it serves the gospel. If it is held against their eyes until they cannot see anything else, it becomes another form of darkness." That sentence was not a rejection of doctrine. It was a rejection of doctrinal control without pastoral humility. Steiner offered his resignation in formal language. Leo accepted it. The statement said the cardinal would retire to prayer and study. It sounded peaceful. It was not peaceful. Inside traditional Catholic circles, alarm spread immediately. If Steiner was gone, what would happen to the boundaries? Would moral teachings soften? Would theologians previously under suspicion return? Would Rome now prioritize experience over revelation? At the same time, priests and theologians in Latin America, Africa, and parts of Asia reacted with something close to relief. Not triumph, relief, the kind that comes when a door you had stopped knocking on finally opens. A rural priest in Honduras wrote privately, "Perhaps now Rome will ask what our people are carrying before telling us what paragraph to quote." Leo's plan for the dicastery was not to abolish discipline. It was to add listening before juror judgment. A new advisory structure was prepared, including theologians from the global south, lay experts, pastoral workers, and women religious with decades of experience among the poor. Not to vote on doctrine. Not to rewrite revelation, to help Rome understand the people to whom doctrine is preached. Steiner retired to a monastery in Germany. Those close to him say he felt betrayed. In his view, the Pope had confused compassion with weakness. But Leo did not see compassion as weakness. He saw it as the only way truth could remain recognizable as Christian. The fourth folder was black, polished, and filled with screenshots. That was Javier Mendoza's world. Mendoza had turned Vatican communication into a global machine. Mexican by birth, trained in media, fluent in the logic of platforms, clips, framing, and emotional timing, he understood the digital age better than almost anyone in Rome. Under his leadership, the Vatican became more visible, more responsive, and far more professional. Social channels multiplied. Videos became sharper. The Pope's words reached millions in minutes. Young Catholics who once ignored Vatican statements now saw them edited, subtitled, packaged, and shared. Mendoza knew something many older churchmen did not. In the modern world, if the church does not tell its story, someone else will tell it for her. But the fourth folder asked whether storytelling had become control. The screenshots were not scandals by themselves. They were drafts, edits, delayed statements, talking points, internal instructions, words removed, words softened, timelines adjusted, questions avoided. In one abuse case, a communication team had proposed language that expressed sorrow without naming responsibility. In a financial controversy, coverage had been redirected toward the Vatican's charitable work. In a doctrinal dispute, an interview had been edited to reduce visible disagreement among bishops. In another case, a community's complaint was acknowledged internally but never publicly addressed, because according to one note, the narrative environment is not favorable. Leo read that phrase 3 times, the narrative environment. He wrote in the margin, "Truth does not wait for favorable weather." That margin note ended Mendoza's future. The final meeting was brief. Mendoza argued that the church cannot communicate without strategy. He said, enemies distort everything. He said the faithful are confused enough already. He said uncontrolled truth can become a weapon in the hands of those who hate the church. He insisted that he had not hidden truth, only protected it from manipulation. Leo answered, "Truth protected by concealment becomes something else." Mendoza looked wounded by that. I was not a villain. In many ways he had served with talent and devotion. He had helped the Vatican speak to a distracted world. He had given the church digital reach it never had before. But Leo believed the cost had become too high. The church had begun to speak like a brand, protecting itself from scandal, rather than a sinner confessing in the presence of God. The official note cited irreconcilable differences in the pastoral vision of communication. That was Vatican language for a deeper rupture. By nightfall, scheduled interviews were suspended. Media teams were reorganized. A 5-year review of Vatican communications was ordered, not to punish staff, to discover what had been delayed, reframed, minimized, or left unsaid in the name of institutional protection. The Pope's instruction was plain: no more polished silence. A Chilean journalist described the change perfectly. For years, the Vatican wanted to look transparent. Leo wants it to be transparent, even when transparency hurts. That distinction mattered. Under Mendoza, the Church had learned how to appear human online. Under Leo, it would have to become human in public. The fifth folder was the strangest. It had no department seal, no official title, no front-page summary, only one handwritten word at the top, influence. Inside was Lorenzo Dantis. Most Catholics had never heard his name. That was how he preferred it. Dantis was not a prefect, not a media figure, not a public theologian, not a diplomat with a recognizable portfolio. His empire was informal, which made it stronger. He knew appointments before they were announced. He knew weaknesses before they became scandals. He knew who wanted promotion, who feared retirement, who owed favors, who could be pressured, and who could be flattered. In Rome, his nickname was the Pope Maker, not because he elected popes alone. No one does. But because for decades he had influenced the pathways that led men toward power. A quiet dinner, a private recommendation, a word in the right ear, a caution expressed as concern, a suggestion placed gently before someone who thought the idea was his own. Dantis understood that institutions are rarely controlled by official charts. They are controlled by relationships. Leo XIV knew this too, and from the first weeks of his pontificate, he refused to enter Dantis's web. He declined courtesy lunches. He ignored lists of preferred appointments. He asked for alternative names. He requested reports from local communities rather than only from nuncios and senior bishops. He wanted to know how candidates treated the poor, whether priests trusted them, whether women religious could speak honestly in their presence, whether lay Catholics felt heard or managed. That last question offended the old system. Dantis reportedly told a friend, "The Holy Father is asking questions that cannot be measured." But that was exactly the point. The fifth folder showed how informal influence had shaped the Church for years. It did not show crimes. It showed habits. Bishops moved forward because they belonged to networks. Others disappeared because they lacked patrons. Talented priests from poor regions remained invisible. Mediocre administrators advanced because they were safe. Certain ideological blocs protected their own. Certain national groups expected their turn. The language was spiritual. The mechanism was political. Leo did not need to accuse Dantis of corruption. He needed to end the role. The suspension letter was surgical. Cardinal Dantis was removed from all advisory involvement in episcopal appointments, ecclesial promotions, reserved consultations, and any informal orientation related to future conclaves. In simpler language, he could no longer move pieces on the board. There was no replacement. That was the revolution. Rome expected someone new to inherit the network. Leo refused. The office behind the office would not be restaffed. The whisperer would not be replaced by a more loyal whisperer. The system itself would be denied oxygen. The reaction inside the Vatican was immediate and unsettled. Men who had built their futures through Dantis suddenly did not know where to stand. Bishops waiting for promotion stopped making confident calls. Officials who had once smiled at Dantis's table began denying they had ever been close to him. The Pope did not comment, but one aide later described his mood as calm, almost relieved. "I was not removing a man," the aide said. "He was removing a fog." Dantis left Rome quietly for a villa in Tuscany. He sent one note to friends. "I have not been defeated. My time has simply ended." It was dignified. It was also accurate. In the Vatican, eras often end long before they are admitted. Leo had simply written the ending down. The sixth folder was green. Maps, mission budgets, conversion charts, school construction plans, medical outreach data, baptism numbers, parish growth graphs, international partnerships, development grants, donor communications. It was the world of Cardinal Tiago Souza, the Brazilian face of global evangelization. Souza was beloved by many, charismatic, articulate, tireless, and fluent in the language of hope. He had made the Church feel expansive. Under him, missions grew, Catholic schools opened, hospitals received funding, development programs reached forgotten regions. International organizations admired him. Bishops praised his ability to secure resources. Young Catholics saw him as proof that the Church could still move outward with confidence. I was not secretive like Bellerini, not calculating like Finch, not severe like Steiner, not polished like Mendoza, not invisible like Dantis. I was visible, warm, and persuasive. That made the green folder harder to read, because Souza's failure was not cruelty, it was scale. The folder showed a missionary model that had become too centralized, too target-driven, too impressed with measurable expansion. Communities became data points. Missions became deliverables. Local needs were translated into categories. Donors understood. Success meant growth, visibility, numbers, buildings, programs, reports. The poor were served, yes, but sometimes they were not listened to. A missionary sister in Bangladesh had written one sentence that Leo underlined. They sent us a building when what we needed was someone to sit with the mothers. In Togo, a school project had been celebrated in Vatican communications, but local leaders complained that the curriculum had been designed elsewhere. In Indonesia, a parish development program had arrived with funding tied to priorities the community had never named. In the Amazon, indigenous Catholics described meetings where Rome asked for reports, but not wisdom. Souza believed he was strengthening the church. Leo believed the church was confusing growth with presence. Their meeting was painful. Souza spoke from the heart. He defended the programs. He named the children educated, the sick treated, the missions supported, the communities reached. He said the church cannot retreat into smallness when the world is waiting. He said evangelization needs structure. Leo agreed. Then he asked, who decides what the people are waiting for? Souza looked down. The Pope continued. A mission that arrives with answers. Before it has heard the wound may be generous, but it is not yet evangelical. That sentence ended the old dicastery. Souza was removed. Projects were paused for review. Not canceled. Reviewed. Local representatives would be consulted. Mission success would be redefined beyond numbers. Lay leaders, women religious, local bishops, and community elders would be asked to speak before Rome designed solutions for them. Critics called it dangerous. They warned that freezing missionary programs could harm the poor. Supporters called it necessary. They said the poor had been used too often as evidence of successful administration while their actual voices remained secondary. Leo's vision was not anti-mission. It was mission stripped of conquest. Evangelization, he believed, begins when the church asks where Christ is already present before it decides what Rome must bring. By the time the sixth dismissal became known, the Vatican no longer felt like itself. Offices stayed lit late. Assistants whispered in corridors. Bishops delayed travel plans. Cardinals called one another and then stopped calling, uncertain who was still safe to trust. Journalists sensed movement, but could not yet name its shape. The official statements were too clean to explain the tremor beneath them. Then, near dusk, the Pope left the Apostolic Palace. No major ceremony had been scheduled. No crowd expected him. He walked into St. Peter's Basilica with only a small group nearby. The basilica was nearly empty. The afternoon light came through the high windows in long, pale shafts, touching marble, bronze, stone, and silence. Leo removed his shoes. No one had told him to do that. No one expected it. He walked barefoot over the cold floor, toward the tomb of Peter. Those who saw it understood immediately that this was not theater. It was instinct. A man who had just removed 6 pillars of institutional power was stepping down into the oldest memory of his office without the protection of ceremony. At the tomb he knelt. For several minutes he did not move. Then he touched the stone and whispered, "Here, we begin again." The phrase traveled faster than any official communique. By night, it was in every Vatican office. By morning, it was on Catholic radio. By the end of the week, it had become the unofficial name for the entire reform. Begin again. But beginning again is not gentle work. The old guard did not disappear. It rarely does. Influence knows how to survive a public defeat. Bellerini still had friends in finance. Finch still had diplomatic allies. Steiner still commanded loyalty among doctrinal conservatives. Mendoza still had media figures who considered him a visionary. Dantis still had people who owed him their careers. Souza still had bishops across the global south who believed he had been treated unfairly. Resistance began quietly. A bishop in Europe warned that the Pope was destabilizing the church. A cardinal in Latin America said privately that Rome had humiliated men who had served faithfully. A conservative commentator accused Leo of replacing tradition with emotion. A progressive activist worried that the reforms were still too dependent on one man's will. Even supporters admitted the danger. What happens when so much change is driven by a pope who refuses to move slowly? Leo heard the criticism. According to one aide, he did not dismiss it. He said, reform without humility becomes another form of domination. That is why the next stage mattered more than the removals themselves. Anyone can remove, few can rebuild. The Pope began assembling temporary commissions for each area of reform. Financial transparency would include lay auditors and representatives from dioceses that rely on Vatican funds. Diplomacy would be reviewed through the lens of persecuted communities, migrants, and local bishops living under pressure. Doctrine would receive pastoral consultation without surrendering theological clarity. Communications would be examined not only for effectiveness, but for honesty. Episcopal appointments would include broader local testimony. Evangelization would be redesigned with communities rather than for them. The language changed, not control. Service, not image. Confession, not expansion. Accompagnement, not influence. Witness. In parishes around the world, ordinary Catholics reacted with an emotion that surprised even priests. Some wept, some felt afraid, some wondered whether this was too much, too fast. But many said the same thing in different languages. At last, Rome is looking at itself. A Catholic teacher in Ohio wrote, "For years, I felt the Church only asked the laity to repent. Now I feel the institution is being asked to repent too." A sister in Guatemala posted, "This is what cleaning the temple looks like when the tables are made of paperwork." A young seminarian in Kenya said, "Maybe holiness is not only personal, maybe institutions also have to become holy." That sentence may explain the entire pontificate. Leo XIV is not trying to make the Church fashionable. He is not trying to make it weak. He is not trying to please the world. He's asking whether the structures built in the name of Christ still behave like Christ. That question is terrifying because it does not stop at 6 cardinals. It moves outward, to dioceses, to seminaries, to Catholic media, to schools, to charities, to religious orders, to every office where the gospel has been translated into budgets, policies, titles, and habits that no one questions because they have always been there. The 6 folders were not an ending. They were a mirror. And mirrors are dangerous in Rome, because once one room sees itself clearly, every other room begins to wonder what would happen if the Pope opened its files next. Within a week, the first measurable consequences began to appear. 3 contracts linked to Vatican charitable investments were suspended pending review. 2 diplomatic statements were rewritten with stronger language on political prisoners. The Doctrine of the Faith announced that several pending cases involving theologians from the Global South would be re-examined, not dismissed, but re-examined with pastoral context included. Communications staff received new internal guidelines requiring that any public statement about abuse, money, or institutional failure must name responsibility before explaining complexity. That last rule shocked people. Name responsibility before explaining complexity. For decades, institutions had done the reverse. They explained complexity until responsibility disappeared inside it. Leo wanted the order reversed. First, say who failed, then explain why. First tell the truth, then ask for understanding. This may sound simple. Inside the Vatican, it was almost revolutionary. A senior Monsignor reportedly complained that the Pope's reforms were designed for people who do not understand how Rome works. When that complaint reached Leo, he did not respond directly. He only wrote a note to one aide. Perhaps the problem is exactly that Rome works this way. That note circulated quietly. The fear disappeared. Not because Leo was shouting, but because he was not shouting. He was writing things down. He was asking for documents. He was reading the footnotes. He was calling people at unexpected hours. He was comparing budgets to outcomes. He was asking nurses, missionaries, teachers, lay accountants, parish priests, mothers, and young seminarians what Rome never asked them before. What did you see? What did you need? Who did not listen? Those questions were more dangerous than accusations. Accusations can be denied. Questions require answers. In Nairobi, a group of young Catholics gathered after Mass to discuss the removals. None of them knew the internal architecture of the Curia. They did not know the history of the Vatican Bank, the diplomacy of the Holy See, or the complicated structure of dicasteries. But they understood the moral picture immediately. One young woman said, "If the Church asks me to confess my sins, then the Church must confess its own." In Manila, elderly parishioners prayed the rosary for the 6 removed cardinals and for the Pope. One man said, "We should not rejoice when men fall, but we should rejoice when truth rises." In Chicago, Catholics, who remembered Robert Prevost, before he was pope, spoke of a pattern they had seen for years. He did not humiliate, he did not rush. But once he believed the vulnerable were being harmed, he became impossible to move. One former classmate said, "People think he is gentle because he is quiet. They misunderstand him. He is gentle because he has already mastered his anger." That may be the key to Leo XIV. He does not perform strength. He withholds performance until strength becomes necessary. Still, the danger remains real. Every reform creates new power. Every commission can become a new bureaucracy. Every promise of transparency can become another slogan. Leo knows this. Those closest to him say he is haunted by the possibility that his reforms could one day be captured by the same habits he is trying to dismantle. That is why he reportedly insisted on one unusual rule for the new temporary commissions. Every commission must include at least one person who has been directly harmed by the kind of system being reviewed. Finance must include someone from a community whose funding vanished. Diplomacy must include someone from a persecuted local church. Doctrine must include someone who has been investigated and someone who has defended investigation. Communications must include a survivor advocate. Appointments must include lay Catholics from dioceses that suffered under poor episcopal leadership. Evangelization must include local voices from mission territories. The point is not revenge. The point is memory. Institutions forget pain when they only consult the powerful. Leo wants pain in the room. That sentence alone explains why the old Vatican is afraid. Because the old Vatican knew how to handle reformers. It knew how to delay them, flatter them, bury them in procedure, surround them with experts, convince them that change must wait for the right moment. But it does not yet know how to handle a pope who keeps asking for the people procedure forgot. And so the story continues. This is why the Vatican feels different now. Not because every problem has been solved. Not because 6 removals can purify 2,000 years of human weakness. Not because Leo XIV has all the answers. It feels different because the old assumption has been broken. The assumption that power inside the church can remain protected if it speaks in holy language. The assumption that secrecy is prudence. The assumption that polish is communication. The assumption that fear is doctrine. The assumption that influence is service. The assumption that growth is mission. The assumption that money, diplomacy, law, media, appointments, and evangelization can be judged only by those who control them. Leo XIV challenged that assumption, and that challenge may be more destabilizing than any single dismissal. For his supporters, this is the long-awaited purification of a church that had become too comfortable with its own machinery. For his critics, it is a dangerous concentration of papal power, disguised as humility. Both sides know one thing. The next appointments will decide whether this moment becomes reform or chaos. Who will replace Bellerini, a lay financial expert, a bishop from the margins, a transparent commission? Who will replace Finch, a diplomat, willing to speak truth even when doors close? Who will replace Steiner, a theologian strong enough to defend doctrine and tender enough to hear wounded souls? Who will replace Mendoza, a communicator who understands that the church does not need a better mask, but a clearer face? Who will replace Dantis? No one if Leo is serious. Who will replace Souza? Perhaps not one man, but a new way of listening. The next move could come quietly. A name in a bulletin, a motu proprio, a restructuring decree, a new council, a leaked memo, a resignation no one expected, a speech at a minor parish that suddenly sounds like a manifesto. That is how this pope moves, and does not always raise his voice. He waits, he reads, encircles one sentence in a report. Then he acts. The 6 folders have closed. The reform they opened has not. And somewhere inside the apostolic palace, on a desk that no camera will ever see, there are already new papers waiting for him in the morning. If this story held your attention, share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe Pope Leo XIV is saving the church from its own machinery, or pushing it into dangerous territory? Would a church with less secrecy, less fear, and less hidden influence bring you closer to faith, or make you worry about the future? Stay with us, because this was not the end of the story. It was the first morning.